Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk about the books that I'm reading this week, or have been reading this week rather. It's been a fun reading week, and ignore all these dust motes that are in this room. I recently sort of moved something in the room and now everything's just sort of, yeah, it would be really pretty if it wasn't dust. Like if this were sort of like a little star shower or something, this would be lovely, but instead this is, just imagine these are stars. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the books that I've been reading this week, and let's get talking about them. First up, we have Glória by Victor Heringer and translated by Sophie Lewis and James Young. And this is a really special book in many ways, partly because unfortunately the author passed away a couple of years ago, and it was one of those things where he died really young, and he had only written a sort of a small number of novels and was this really up-and-coming star in Brazilian literature, and sort of sadly passed away really young. And so it's really strange now reading back over his books and kind of thinking about what other things he could have gone on to carry on writing. But I really loved The Love of Singular Men. It was one of my favourite books of last year, and Glória I loved just as much, if not maybe more actually. I think this is exquisite. It's what I've loved from the two books I've read of his is just this very absurd sense of humour that comes in with often kind of the sort of line between tragedy and comedy is quite sort of blurred, but there's something really absurd about the way that he adds these things on. So for example, this book is largely about a family who the Costa e Oliveira family, and they are this group of people who basically keep on dying one after the other, and there's something about the way that their deaths happen that feels almost like a fate foretold, almost like there's a sort of prophecy of how they're going to die, or that they're all going to die and there's a curse on them and whatever, but never in a particularly heavy way. People sort of die, and the book kind of acknowledges them by saying this is sad, but also like, oh, well, you know, got another one. And there's something about the kind of dryness of that humour that I found really captivating in this book, that almost in a kind of fairy tale way of people dying by sort of slightly odd circumstances. But actually, in the most part, this book is just, there's almost an extra level of irony or sort of sarcasm that sits over everything. And so, for example, there's a really fun part in the book where, and again, this doesn't sound like fun immediately, but we have the lists of a couple of characters and a couple of people and how they died listed in a newspaper. And at one point it says that this person lived in this particular town in Brazil and died of heartbreak. And then the book kind of interjects with, or maybe, and then the name of the town, sort of suggesting that actually the town itself is enough to cause heartbreak or boredom that might kill someone. And there are these little footnotes that are often just almost laugh out loud funny for just how stupid and absurd they are, where a character says something and the footnote basically says, yeah, there's no real record of this. This makes no actual sense. Who knows what this person's talking about? And it's kind of these little interjecting bits that are so ripe with humour and are so silly and so funny, but actually at the heart of it, this book is this really beautiful story of a family and all of their quirks and all of their bits of silliness and all of these other things, and I just found this utterly captivating. I love this. I really enjoyed The Love of Singular Men, and it's something about when an author seems to write in a way that almost feels like they're in your head, but is also a step ahead of you, that I find utterly brilliant. And it's such a sad loss for this author, and but how wonderful that we've been left with some of his incredible work as well. Next up, a pretty small book by an unknown author, Sally Rooney with Intermezzo. And this book, obviously, you know, any kind of Sally Rooney book will automatically come with a lot of buzz. And I find it really interesting seeing reactions to Sally Rooney, because people often go completely in the, she's brilliant, she's the most genius author who's, you know, of our generation kind of thing, or kind of this sort of thing about her being overhyped or whatever. And without it sort of sounding like I'm trying to sit on the fence with this, I'm sort of somewhere in the middle of those two things. I think some of the hype is an odd thing, but I also think she's incredibly good at what she does. And I've still not read Conversations with Friends, but sort of from Normal People, Beautiful World, Where Are You, and now this, I feel like I'm enjoying her books more and more. And I think particularly what I really like is her sense of interiority. So in this book, we watch as particularly four characters really, although there's sort of a main relationship at the heart of it, exist in some kind of quadrangle thing or square of relationships. There is a sort of natural parallel that's set up with Margaret, an older woman. And the book's version of older woman, by the way, is that this woman is 36, and I am 35. And I found, I kept on, every time they're like, wow, she's so old. So I was like, sorry, excuse you. But yeah, so she's older in the context of this relationship because she is, I think, 36, and she's going out with Ivan, who is 21, I think, or very early 20s. And they are sort of set up as, you know, where those power imbalances or dynamics lie because of their because of gender, because of age, and various other things. But equally, Ivan's brother is dating a slightly younger woman, and there's a dynamic that's brought up particularly because of her sort of slight financial dependence on others. And so the book sort of automatically sets up something in a very Rooney-esque way, that there is a kind of, the elements of power are being dissected, and particularly power when it comes to sex and relationships and gender and various other things. It's something Rooney has sort of interacted with a lot in her work so far, and that continues this trend. But I think she does some really interesting things with it, particularly because we have characters who sort of perform or don't perform their gender in a way that's expected. So Ivan is this sort of slightly nerdy man who is a chess champion or fanatic. I don't really know either way. He plays a lot of chess. And he is sort of seen as this slightly uncool man, versus Margaret, who is slightly more worldly and has this presence to her. But equally, this comes up quite a lot in terms of where money and power and sex and various other things interact. And what I really enjoy with Sally Rooney is how she investigates internal sort of thoughts and states of being. So in terms of the plot of the book, not a great deal really happens. You know, people will go on dates, they'll talk to each other, they'll have sex, they'll have arguments, all of these things happen. But I think the real crux of what makes Sally Rooney so compulsively readable, at least for me, is the way that she's able to understand her character's motivations and fears and vulnerabilities with regards to those things. So we will see two characters having sex, and we will hear their inner thoughts of the various ways that they will hold back, or they will say something, or they'll suddenly feel that they're not in control of who they are, or that they're really in control of who they are, and the various ways that they find identity or find who they are through those things. And I think that's where she's really sharp, and really, really readable and really intelligent, I think, in terms of understanding these little ways that people might feel particularly inadequate or feel particularly vulnerable in a setting that seems so everyday. You know, two people having a conversation, but because it's following a first date or it's following a time where they've had sex, there's something, it's laced with a kind of danger of neither side really being able to talk about what they exactly feel, or if they do, they feel like they've oversaid things. And I think that's where she's really strong, and what I really enjoyed about this book as well. Next up, we have Olga Tokarczuk with The Empusium, a health resort horror story, translated by Antonia Lloyd-Jones. And Olga Tokarczuk is just such a fascinating author, I think, in many ways, particularly the way that she investigates sometimes the more everyday, or sometimes the more slightly fantastical elements, and somehow manages to find some way of weaving in elements of the other with them. And this is a book that sort of takes as its sort of initial jumping off point The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, which I just finished reading last week. And this is kind of, I read it in advance of this, basically to help with understanding it. And actually, The Empusium, I think, although it relates to Magic Mountain, isn't fully reliant on it as a base text, in the sense that I think you can read The Empusium without having read The Magic Mountain, and it works still, because the kind of, it's sort of speaking back to it in a way that is not reliant on you knowing the story. You know, sometimes retellings or writing back versions really require you to understand the base text first, to be able to understand what the other book's doing. And I think with Empusium, I think that isn't as necessary. Anyway, but the core idea is very similar to Magic Mountain, at least at first. The people are at a health resort. It's set in a kind of similar time frame. It deals with this kind of this sort of breadth of Central Europe, where there is, although this is kind of taking place around Switzerland, we have characters from sort of Germany and Poland and various neighbouring countries all involved. And so there's a kind of socio-political thing going on within it anyway. But this book builds and builds. And I think what's particularly interesting is the way that Olga Tokarczuk turns her lens on particularly men, and particularly sexist men from over history, and particularly very well established figures. So I don't think it spoils anything, but the acknowledgements part of this book, she lists a set of people, a set of particularly writers or public figures, and names them one by one, saying the elements of misogyny that I use in this book are either borrowed directly from or are kind of a play on something said by these men. And it's a long list of fairly established writers. And in many ways, that it sort of is an interesting response to Magic Mountain, because Magic Mountain, although it features women characters in the book, is largely focused on a fair few men, and the women are relatively sidelined in that story. And in some ways, there's something quite fun about the way that Olga Tokarczuk kind of reimagines this and sort of says, well, actually, we're still going to have a situation where the women might not feature prominently, but I really want to examine why that might be and how the men in the story might contribute to these women feeling that they're not part of this story. And particularly as Magic Mountain and the Empusium both deal with the idea of rest and rest cures, something that was often targeted specifically at women who did not seem to meet expectations of what women should be doing at the time. So, for example, women were often sent to rest cure centres for being suspected of hysteria. And instead of addressing any root causes for why women might be having a particularly hard time in society, it was sort of just seen as, well, they'll go off to the mountains, not be allowed to read or write or do anything. They'll just have to rest for a bit, and that will sort them out. And so I think there's something really fun and interesting going on within this book, on the kind of the underbelly of this book, where Olga Tokarczuk is kind of needling at some of those little points, by kind of allowing the words of some of these men to stand in a way that the modern day reader would also then provide their own critique for. And there's something quite interesting about how this is all threaded together that I really enjoyed once I kind of worked out what she was doing with it. I sometimes struggle a bit with some of her writing. I struggled, actually no, I say that. I struggle with Books of Jacob. I enjoyed Drive Your Plough and Flights. So yeah, this is an interesting one. And I really enjoyed what she was doing here, and how she took the very stylized sort of prose of something like Magic Mountain, and brought it into a story like this. So it feels like it's of that time, but the expectation is that the reader is in our time and can therefore see this book slightly differently as well. Next up, on a different note, I read No Small Thing by Orlaine McDonald. And I found out about it because she's a fairly local author to me. And there was an event at my local bookshop that I unfortunately couldn't make. But I thought this book sounded interesting anyway. But essentially a core part of it is we learn right from the beginning of this book that there has been somebody attempting to, well, potentially an accident or potentially someone trying to take their own life. And we hear from particularly four characters, a man who lives near sort of the next apartment along, and three women who are related. They are kind of three generations of women. And the hint that we get from the beginning of this book is that we think it might be one or two of them. We kind of get a feeling that there's a particular focus on some of the women, that we learn that one of them is going through a lot and is particularly feeling rough, and so we think that it's likely that it could be her, but actually the book leaves this very open at first, and so we have to try and unpick the clues. But we particularly see the difficulties in the relationships between these women, particularly our kind of middle woman in terms of these three generations, who has, by her own admission, not always been a great mother, but is trying to rectify it now. And because of that, her daughter has often been left with her own mother, so with the daughter's grandmother. And so as a result, there's this kind of complicated thing where all of them have some kind of interwoven history with each other. But actually at the heart of it, there's a sort of an attempt for these characters to understand each other and really understand where they've gone wrong. And, you know, can these things be undone? Can they be forgiven? And particularly in the case of this woman who sees herself as being a bad mother and whose daughter sees that of her, she is often claiming things around, you know, well, I was trying my best, or now I'm trying my best, what can I do? And I think this book really interrogates those in a really fascinating way, and quite a fresh way, I think, as well. Last but not least, I read Disturbance by Jenna Clake. And this book I thought was a really short, sharp story in a way that I really did not expect from it. I was reading it sort of part of the Nota Bene prize shortlist. And they're quite interesting books generally anyway, because they tend to be kind of literary fiction that's really compulsively readable, and is also kind of sort of straddles a bit of a line between general and literary fiction. And I thought this was so interesting because the core part of this is there is a young woman who is seeing things happening in her neighborhood, and she, you know, we're sort of with her at the beginning, and we think that the title Disturbance is mostly about, you know, somebody coming in late or somebody making noise at 2 a.m. in the local area. And the book is partly about that. But the book also starts to look at the kind of wider ways that people are struggling in this book. All of which eventually turns towards magic and witchcraft, not in a kind of fantastical way, but very much in the kind of, I'm burning this herb to try and cast a spell on my boyfriend to stop calling me, or I'm doing this to cleanse the toxic energy, or I'm doing this to cut ties with this person. But what really starts to happen is this very propulsive plot around this magic, around the kind of fantastical elements of this, almost of well, maybe fantastical is not the right word, but the kind of the kind of spiritual ways, I guess, that this magic is being attempted. And so the book will sort of examine somebody trying to cast a spell to cast off all negative energy, only to realize that there's something more toxic going on around them anyway, or that actually it didn't work because the problem still lies within that person themselves. And so this book really plays with these elements in a way that I don't think I've really seen done in fiction. It was really really interesting how this book does it, and sort of satirizes it at the same time. So somebody trying to do a spell and kind of thinking, well, I've not got this item, but maybe, I don't know, maybe something from my fridge will do. And this kind of and then these sort of other girls around her basically saying, you're doing it all wrong, what on earth do you think you're doing? And there's something really clever, I think, about the way that this book threads together, as well as being basically a thriller, so that we've got a wider story about this young woman at the heart of the book who cannot let go, or is really struggling to process some of the various things that have happened to her, but is also perhaps not fully aware of her own role within other things happening in the book as well. So yeah, really, really interesting book, and completely unexpected. I just sort of got it out from the library, seeing it on the prize list, not really knowing much about it, but I'm really glad that I've read it now. It's a very weird but fun little book. And so those are the books that I've been reading this week. I hope you're having a really good week. I hope you're keeping well, and take care, and speak to you all very soon. Bye bye.